I imagine something moving, okay? But a joint does not have to move. And so we're going to see an example of a joint that doesn't move. A joint just holds two bones together. So we're not going to memorize all too many names of joints, at least not in lecture. We'll do a little bit more in lab. But when you start to see the name is primarily going to be based on the names of the bones involved. So you take the bones that are held together by that joint, take those names, mash them up together, and you have the name of your joint. So this is the joint that holds the radius and the ulna together. So it's the radial-ulnar joint. We classify them, we put them into groups based on how the joints are held together. And there are four main types that we're going to talk about. There's bony, fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints. When you think of a joint, something that moves like this, and all of these, you're thinking of synovial joints. These are probably not really even things that you really ever thought of as joints. So a bony joint, also called a synostosis, is an immobile joint. It's not going to move, and it's just going to form when you have two bones that are next to each other, and the space between them ossifies. And so essentially what it does is it takes two bones and combines them into one. We still consider them two separate bones that are held together by this bony joint, but in reality, functionally, at this point, they're essentially one bone. An example of this are the left and right mandibular bones in children. So at a very, very young age, the two halves of your jaw, right in the middle, are not connected. There's essentially just cartilage there with two separate bones. At our age, though, we essentially have one jawbone, but it came from two parts. So now that center joint there has calcified, it's hard. It's basically bone, so essentially we only have one. We're going to see examples of these sutures, but sutures are joints that hold the different plates in our skull together. And so when you're born, they're pretty flexible. At our age, they're still a little bit flexible. They're not completely bony, just a little bit of cartilage. But as we get older and older and older, they become harder and harder and harder. So when we're all really old, those sutures are pretty much going to be just complete bone. I suppose so, yes. Older people are hard-headed. And then our first rib, actually over age, where it connects to our spine or our sternum, it actually goes from collagen to hard bone. And so that collagen starts out as flexible. Over time, it turns into hard bone. And so it looks like one single rib, but it's actually a bony rib with a bony joint connecting it to the sternum. And so these are going to start as one of the other types of joints. These are never going to form from scratch. You're going to start with either a fibrous joint or a cartilaginous joint, and it's going to harden into a bony joint. So we're going to take a look at these fibrous joints. And so essentially what you have bones that are next to each other, so adjacent, they're bones that are next to each other. They're going to be held together by collagen. So fibrous joints are going to be held together by collagen. And there are three types of these fibrous joints: sutures, gomphoses, and syndesmoses. So sutures were what we're talking about in our skull. And so they look essentially like cracks. And so there are actually three different types of how these sutures can come together. You have two plates that are going to come together. If you just have two flat surfaces that come together, that's essentially going to be called a plane suture. If you have two triangle-shaped pieces that come together and overlap. It's a lap suture. And if you have just kind of a jagged suture, that's just going to be a serrate suture. Kind of think of a serrated knife, right? These are examples of those three. I'm not asking you to memorize these examples of the subtypes, okay? You need to know the example of sutures are in the skull, okay? That's the level that I'm asking you to know right now. Gomphoses are a joint where you have essentially individual kind of spread out collagen fibers that are going to attach one bone to another, and there's going to be a space between them. So this is a tooth. So this is the socket of your tooth, and then you have your tooth, and your tooth is actually held into the socket by these collagen strands. Why do you think we have this empty space here? Well, they grow down in your gums and they kind of come up. So they don't really grow once they're up. Say it again?
So they do keep going up. The only reason they stay in place is because they are constantly chewing.
Well, they go up, they don't grow.
Oh, no.
They don't get bigger. Yeah.
Because we use them a lot to bite things, the stress, pressure.
Yeah.
Like a shock absorber.
Exactly. These are essentially little shock absorbers. And so every time you bite something, these are going to move. Just a small amount. It's not like rubber bands or anything. You can't push on your tooth and, well, hopefully, when you push on your tooth, it doesn't move, right? But at very high forces, it's going to move a little bit. That takes force off of your jaw, off of the joints in your jaw, off the bone, off the tooth itself. This prevents things from breaking. It kind of takes the edge off of that. The third type are these syndesmoses. These are similar, but instead of having something like a tooth in a pocket with these kind of spread out collagen fibers, you're going to have two bones that are parallel to each other, and then you're going to have a whole bunch of these long collagen fibers. And so rather than a small number of short fibers, here we have a whole bunch of very long fibers. And the best example of this is going to be the joint between the radius and the ulna in our arm. So we're going to talk about this, I think it's the last slide, so you don't need to copy too much information off this, you don't even have this picture. But until you actually are told what's going on, you probably don't realize what happens when you just twist your forearm. And so in actuality, if I hold my arm out like that, the radius and the ulna are parallel to each other, but when I twist it, the bones actually twist on themselves. And so there's a joint holding these bones together. And so it's going to have to be a very stretchy joint, right? There's going to have to be a lot of space. They're going to have to be long fibers because they need to twist a long ways. But they also need to be very stretchy because imagine, rather than using something like a bungee cord, if you just used a long string, when I'm like this, it's going to be all loose and flopping around, so my arm is just going to fall apart. The two bones are going to float away from each other. You need something that is short when I'm like this, but when I go like this, they can really stretch. And it's a very long joint where they're going to have a lot of stress on it, and so they have to be very numerous in the number of collagen strands that you have. Imagine I go to pick something heavy up like this. A lot of that force is going to be working at pulling those two bones apart. Those collagen fibers are going to prevent that from happening. We also have the same idea going on in the tibia and the fibula in our leg. And so this is not quite as mobile. I mean, I can't move my leg nearly as much as I can my arm, right? And when you do it, you can feel you're really having to work at it, whereas your arm is very easily So those were our fibrous joints. We had the three types. Then there's the cartilaginous joints. The cartilaginous joints are going to be held together by cartilage. Fibrous joints are collagen. Cartilaginous joints are cartilage. Another term for these are amphioarthrosis. And again, you have two bones held together by cartilage. And there are two types of these. There's the synchondroses and then symphyses. So the synchondroses are hyaline cartilage. So if you remember when we talked about different types of cartilage, hyaline cartilage was the clear type. Very fine strands of cartilage. And so that's what's going to be holding this together. This is the type of cartilage that is in those epiphyseal plates. And hopefully you just put as an answer on your exam, right? Also, the first rib to the sternum. So up here, our first rib, this is our sternum with a breastplate. Our first rib is bone here, but where it connects is cartilage. And this is one of these synchondroses. A symphysis is fibrocartilage. So this is whiter, tougher, with more coarse collagen fibers. So this, an example of this, is down at the bottom of our pelvis. So that is fibrocartilage down there. And then also the cartilage between the vertebra of our spine is going to be fibrocartilage. Why do you think here we have fibrocartilage, but in other places we have hyaline cartilage? Yeah,
Because the fibrocartilage has to bear the weight of our torso and our head.
Yeah, so fibrocartilage is tougher. It's a much coarser, denser cartilage. And so these things are things that are going to bear a lot of weight, like you said. All of the weight up here gets put on your spine. It's pressing down on it. If you have something that's too soft, it's just going to crush. And then down here, all of the weight of your organs are pushing on this. Imagine if that broke. Your pelvis is going to want to split apart. There's a lot of force on that joint. So here we have fibrocartilage instead of the hyaline cartilage. So what this is saying, each little joint here is not very flexible. But when you bend your spine, each one only has to bend a little bit. And so over a large number of vertebrae, you can get a decent arc of your back. So now we're going to move on to synovial joints. This is where the meat of the lecture is. Okay? The other ones are pretty simple. They don't even move. These are the ones that we think of when we think of a joint. In a synovial joint, also called the diarthrosis, we have two bones that are separated by a cavity, and then there's going to be a capsule kind of holding everything together. These are the ones that are going to move, and because they move, they're the most complex. There's a lot of parts that are going to go into this. Because they move, because they're complex, these are the ones that people have problems with. If something like a suture breaks, yes, as long as you don't die of brain damage, it's going to heal and no big deal, right? But if you have just a little bit of a problem with your elbow or your wrist or anything, it can really damage your quality of life. So if you're going to a doctor or a physical therapist or something about a joint, it's probably about a synovial joint. And these are the ones that we constantly are using. So in a synovial joint, we have articular cartilage. Now, articular cartilage is something that we talked about, at least mentioned last week. This is the cartilage that's going to be on the end of a long bone, where the two long bones come together. It's not very thick, but there's a decent amount there. 2 or 3 millimeters isn't a ton, but it's a nice covering. It's something that you can actually see, and if you had, you could really scrape off. The space between the two bones is going to be the joint cavity or the articular cavity. And then in that cavity is going to be synovial fluid. This is the lubrication of your joint. It has albumin, which is a protein, and hyaluronic acid. It's going to create kind of a gel, slippery substance. It has a couple purposes. Number one, it contains nutrients in it that are going to be used to maintain the articular cartilage. And then also we're going to see there are cells in this joint cavity. And so if you have cells, you're going to be creating waste products. And so you need some way to get rid of that. And the synovial fluid is going to play a role in that. And it essentially gets rid of all of the friction in your joints. So as long as you have enough synovial fluid in your joints, and it's functional, there's nothing wrong with it, you really don't have any solid parts rubbing on each other. If we go back and look at that, you will never find bone on bone. You won't even find cartilage on cartilage, right? And so both of these, when that joint moves, they're just going to move inside of a fluid. And so there's going to be very, very little friction there. Around this space is going to be the capsule. What this is essentially going to hold the synovial fluid in. If you didn't have walls on the side, the synovial fluid would just leak out. You wouldn't be able to hold it there. The outer part of the capsule is actually a continuation of the periosteum of the bone. And so we have the periosteum, remember that's the very outside of the bone, it's running down here. When it gets to the joint, it kind of bows out, comes down here, comes back to the next bone, and continues on. Same thing over here. The inner side is called the synovial membrane, and it has cells very similar to fibroblasts that are going to make the synovial fluid, and there are also macrophages which are part of the immune system. So it's going to look for debris, mostly pathogens and things that get into here, take it up and get rid of it. So we have two membranes here. There's the outer membrane here, and then the inner membrane here. The outer one is part of the periosteum. The inner one is its own separate membrane called the synovial membrane, and this is going to make the synovial fluid. Some of these joints also have extra sets of cartilage in them. And so over here, we see lateral meniscus and medial meniscus. So let's start down here. Essentially what this is extra cartilage is going to form a bowl shape down here where this can really fit into. And so you can imagine it almost functions as two separate joints there. But they work completely together. There's no way that one can move and the other can't. This provides extra shock absorption. Has anyone ever torn a meniscus? Heard of people tearing a meniscus? Where does it happen? Your knees. Knees are probably the most abused joint in our body, right? They get beat up. All of our weight goes onto our knees. Every time I take a step, all of that weight is going onto them. I take a step, all of my weight is on one knee at one time. If I go running, I'm doing it very hard. It's very easy to twist the knee, because every time I take a step, if I step on something that's uneven, my knee twists. So it's very easy for this to get torn. Imagine this is here, and it twists. If I have a bowl, and I have something set in the bowl, and the thing set in the bowl goes like that, you're essentially going to snap that part of the bowl off. So coming up, so those are meniscus. Up here, we have also are called articular discs, and these are just going to be similar to this, but this kind of a flat disc that goes all the way across. So rather than a bowl, it's just a flat layer of cartilage. We see this temporomandibular is your jaw. And so this is something that is going on up here. Yeah?
I know stretching is part of the muscular thing. Does that hurt your meniscus also because you're bending it further than what it probably needs to? Or is it normal?
If you bend it too far, number one, if your muscles aren't ready for it, if you force it, your joint's probably going to try to make up for what your muscles can't do. Whereas if you normally stretch that way, your muscles can flex in such a way to stay within the limits of your joints. Does that make sense? No. Awesome. This is a nice point down here. Because you have these bowls, it really helps to prevent this from slipping. Imagine you just had a flat layer of cartilage here. This would very easily just slide back and forth. But if it fits in there, then it tries to move and it's going to hit that wall and keep it in place. In our joints, there are some other parts other than the fundamental parts. We call them accessory structures. We've already talked about tendons, right? Tendon is connective tissue. It's collagen, and it's going to attach muscle to bone. A ligament is very similar, but a ligament attaches one bone straight to another bone. Tendon is muscle to bone. Ligament is bone to bone. Then there are bursa. So a bursa is kind of like a water balloon. These are hard to picture, so the next figure shows them. Essentially, they are little water balloons filled with synovial fluid that fit in between muscles, tendons, ligaments, and bones and things, and act as protection and lubrication when things move. So it's going to cushion muscles. So when we move, muscles are going to push against bone. If you have this fluid-filled sac between them, it can kind of cushion that blow. It helps things move over each other more easily, so you don't have as much friction. And it can also change direction of a tendon. So if a tendon pulls, it's going to want to straighten up. Imagine if I have a rubber band shaped like that. Imagine this is my tendon, and I pull on this end. What's going to happen to the shape of that tendon? It's going to straighten out, right? But if I have the tendon and it's inside basically a tube, now if I reach in and pull that tendon, what's going to happen to the shape? It's going to stay the same shape, right? And so this is going to allow me to change the direction of the pull. I pull the tendon down here. What direction is the other end going to pull? It's essentially going to pull up. Imagine this is attached to a weight on this end, and I pull down here, it's going to pull that up. Very similar to a bursa, it's a tendon sheath. This is just essentially that. Okay? So a bursa doesn't have to be this long shape. A bursa in that long shape around a tendon is called a tendon sheath. So this is what we were looking at. So imagine this. So the green are the bursa. So you can imagine here, this is not this shape, right? This is very clearly a big thing that's kind of a protection, serves a protection purpose. Whereas down here, we have tendons running along our fingers that need to be able to change what direction that force is being applied. Here we have bursa, down here we're going to have tendon sheaths. All the fancy specific names on this figure, you don't need to know. You just need to know bursa and tendon sheaths, and sort of the difference between them and what role they play. Okay, so next is talking about the types of synovial joints, and there are 6 of them. We're going to talk about each one. I'll keep coming back to this slide, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it. The first is a ball and socket joint. That is this one. It is basically just a ball fitting into a cup. And you can imagine that ball in that cup can rotate any way it wants, so long as you don't rotate it so far that this part comes over here and hits the cup. But you can go up, down, left, right, diagonal, doesn't really matter, right? So that's a ball and socket joint. This is, because it can go in every direction, we call it multi-axial. It can move x-axis, y-axis, z-axis, f-axis, whatever you want, right? If you can imagine a direction, this can move in it. And this is the only type of multi-axial joint in our body. The other ones are going to be limited to 1 or 2 axes. The examples of this are our shoulders and our hips. I can move this all around very easily, right? So that is a ball and socket joint. Next are condylar, also called ellipsoid joints. That is this one here. And so it's showing that this is here. Be careful when you look at that picture. It's easy to think that this is the first joint of your finger, but in actuality, it's this one. This here is your hand. That's the palm of your hand. These sticking down here are what we think of as our fingers. So where this really here is our knuckle. So think about your knuckle, and this is what it looks like at the bony level. And so we have an oval part that fits into an oval-shaped cup. It's similar to that, but it's oval-shaped. And so you can imagine this is not going to be able to move as freely in all directions as that. And so think about your knuckle. Which directions can your knuckle move? One's very easy, right? What about the other one? Use pointer finger. We'll talk. Thumb is actually a different type of joint. Use your pointer finger. It can kind of go like that, right? Like the Kembe Matumbo type thing. It doesn't work very well, right? It goes a little bit. Maybe if I did this more often, I'd be able to move it further. But it definitely does not go side to side as well as a ball and socket, right? It goes a little bit, but not very well. If you take an oval and try to rock it, that's just not going to work. Because as this side goes down, the other side's going to come up. Whereas a ball will just stay right in there and move in place. So that is a condylar joint. It is biaxial. We can move it in 2 directions. Best example is this metacarpal phalangeal. Yes, thank you. Reading it from the side is not easy. It's your knuckle, okay? Then there are saddle joints. This is essentially this. You have 2 U shapes that come together. So let's come back and look at a picture of that. That is this. And so this is going to move very well in 2 directions. I can move like this very easily. I can move like this very easily. But I can't go like this. It's not going to work. So this is going to be another biaxial joint. And this is what's on your thumb. So think about your thumb. Your thumb moves side to side a whole lot better than your pointer finger does, right? That allows us to take our thumb and move it and oppose it, okay? mine, so yours may not look exactly like mine. But you don't believe, if I wear a glove, the seam on the thumb runs right down the middle of my thumb. It's very annoying. So mine's like permanently opposed. I like to say that means I'm more evolved, but whatever. And so your thumb does that a whole lot better than your fingers do, right? Because this is a saddle joint, whereas these are not. Then there are plane joints. These are just essentially two flat surfaces of bones sliding against each other. That is this over here. So this is our wrist. If you've ever seen an x-ray of your hand, there's just a whole bunch of blocky bones in your wrist. And when we move our wrist, those blocks just kind of slide. There isn't a nice connection where two things fit together and then they move. This is just multiple things that are able to slide amongst themselves. This is also, these are usually biaxial, but because they can kind of slide however, it's really dependent on what's holding them together. If the tendons and muscles and things are only going to allow them to slide one direction, then they're only going to slide one direction. The best example here is your wrist, your ankle is essentially the same idea. Then there are hinge joints. Hinge joints are like this. And so we have, imagine a hammer, and the hammer comes down and it sits inside of a long kind of trough shape. And so again, you can imagine this is going to rotate like this very well, but it's not going to be able to go like that. These are monoaxial because of that. It's only going to rotate the one direction. And this is going to be your elbow and your knee. And also the joints in your actual fingers and your toes. My arm straightens out, it can't go any further, right? It can only go one direction, and I can't twist my elbow. If I do this, it's actually my shoulder going. I dare you to twist your elbow without popping it out of place and screaming in pain. If you can pop it out of place and not scream in pain, I'll buy you a Coke. Finally, there are pivot joints. So pivot joint is this. So this is very different than all of the other ones. These are two bones that run parallel to each other, and at the end, you kind of have something similar to a ball and socket joint, where they fit right in there, but it's only going to be for twisting. It's not going to be for lateral movement, it's just going to be twisting. This is monoaxial. All we can really do is twist. We can't even really move in any axes. And this is going to be the radioulnar joint. So when we do this, we'll see essentially, when we do that, the radius is going to twist in place there. The ulna is going to more or less stay in the same place. That's going to be the cup shape here, whereas the radius is the part that fits into it, and it's going to twist in place.
What about our neck? Would that be one? Or no?
Neck is, it's a bunch of vertebrae, and so it's a little more it doesn't really fit into any of those. So finally, we have to talk about the movement in these joints. Okay? Different types of movements are going to have different names. These are not going to be too bad. Most of them come in pairs, because I can move my arm out, I can move it in, I can move it up, I can move it down. So usually they're going to come in pairs. And when we talk about these, we're going to use our planes and our directions that we learned the first week of class, and then also had on the lab exam. All of these movements are going to start in what we call zero position, which is whatever position that joint is in anatomical position. And so imagine what the joints look like when I'm standing like this, and that is going to be 0 position. And all of the movements, up, down, left, right, are going to be based off that starting position. So, starting with our arm, so if you go and make a muscle, that's called flexion. So bringing that in towards your body is going to be flexion, and extension is going to be taking it out. Flexion, if you imagine the joint angle here, it's going to be decreasing that angle. Here's 180, here's 90, now it's smaller, right? If I go the opposite direction and I increase that angle, that's going to be extension. Same thing with the hand here. You have extension, so flexion would be decreasing it. There's 90, 180. And then hyperextension is extending further so that the angle actually seems to get smaller. This is now 270, but if you look at it superficially, I now have a 90 here. This went from 180 to 90. Only some joints can hyperextend. Elbow is not going to hyperextend. If it does, I have to buy you a couple. But don't scream, right? But wrist, you can. Next is abduction and adduction. So abduction is going to be, both of them are going to be in the frontal plane. So imagine I'm standing here. The frontal plane is going to cut me in the front and back, right? So I'm only going to move within that plane. So it's essentially jumping jacks. So if I'm standing here, abduction is going to move my arms and hands away from the midline. So if I go like this, that's abduction. I'm taking it away from the midline. Just like hyperextension, hyperabduction is continuing to go, so now it's actually coming closer to the midline. So imagine starting from an anatomical position, coming out, that's abduction, and if you keep going, so it starts to come back, that's going to be hyperabduction. And adduction is just going to be the opposite. When you bring it back down, that's going to be adduction. Hyperadduction, imagine if I bring it down and I keep going like that. Now I've crossed the midline, and again, they're going away from the midline. But I'm still going in the same direction, so that's hyperadduction. Crossing your fingers is the same idea, just crossing my legs is the same thing. I'm bringing them towards the midline, but now it's moving away from the midline. Elevation and depression are really easy. Elevation is going up, depression is going down. Both of them are going to be in the frontal plane. If I'm standing here and I go up or down, I'm elevating or depressing. Protraction is going to be moving forwards. Retraction is going to be going backwards. So in the transverse plane, what's the transverse plane? Right. So imagine cutting me in half like this. The transverse plane is going like this. If I go out, that is protraction. If I go back, that is retraction. So whether it's going out and coming back, so undoing a protraction, or starting here and going back, that's going to be retraction. Out of curiosity, does this guy look like someone anyone recognizes? Not in this class, maybe from a movie.
Chris Pratt?
No.
Okay.
As soon as I saw him, I thought, wow, that
The
looks
guy
like,
with the long last name?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Anybody seen Billy Madison?
Oh,
He looks like O'Doyle, well, one of the O'Doyles. If you've seen the movie, and you know what I'm talking about, go home and look it up. I tried to find a picture. He kind of looks like...
Talking about this guy, I just like...
Yeah, so that's the dad. So that's the dad, and then there's a number of younger children. So this guy looks like the guy in high school with a beard. How many people have no idea what Billy Madison is?
Oh, man. I quote that every time I have first day of school, man.
You wouldn't believe in high school? No, that was college. That was honors composition in college. I wrote a paper about the hero Billy Madison, and I got an A on it. The first line was a quote, is you ain't cool unless you pee your pants. That was the opening line of my essay.
Solid.
Okay. Next, circumduction. So circumduction is going to be circular motions. And so I'm taking my arm, one end is staying in place. The other end is moving. This end is essentially just rotating in place. But in terms of moving up and down, left and right, it's not moving, but the other end is definitely moving. Then there's rotation. This is essentially going to be twisting. And so we can rotate a number of things. We can rotate our body, we can rotate our arms, we can rotate our legs. If you turn a bone towards the middle, that's going to be a medial rotation. If you turn a bone away from your body, that's going to be a lateral rotation. Then there's supination and pronation. That's the twisting of our bones. And so supination is going into the anatomical position. This is supination. Pronation is this. And so if we look at the bones, in the anatomical position, the radius and ulna are running parallel to each other. But when I go through pronation and I turn my arm upside down, the muscles actually take the bones and cross them. To me, when I first saw that, I was like, no way. And I was holding my arm, going like this, trying to figure it out, and it just doesn't make sense. I mean, those are big, heavy bones that are moving all over the place. You really are only going to see this in your forearm. Like we said, it happens in your leg also, but your leg doesn't twist nearly as much. That's our joints. Questions about